Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action. And thank you for joining us for this Book Club of California presentation. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and host this webinar. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and the benefits are many. We simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or to donate or to just find out more about the Book Club of California. Okay, and now for tonight's program and our presenter. Again, the program is titled Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action. And our presenter is Dr. Donna J. Nicol. Dr. Donna J. Nicol is the Associate Dean for Personnel and Curriculum in the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Nicol earned her BA in History and African American Studies from California State University, Fullerton, and her MA in History from California State University, Long Beach. She earned a master's degree in Educational Policy and Leadership and a PhD in Educational Studies with a specialization in African American educational history from The Ohio State University. Dr. Nicol's research and teaching centers on history and politics of African American educational access, with a focus on philanthropic foundations, university trustee boards, and African American women as faculty, university administrators, and educational activists. Dr. Nicol is a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, a life member of the Association of Black Women Historians, member of the California Faculty Association, and serves on the board of directors for the Historical Society of Southern California. Tonight, Dr. Nicol is going to talk about Dr. Claudia H. Hampton, the California State University system's first Black woman trustee, who later became the board's first woman chair. And she'll talk about her book, Black Woman on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action. Now, Black Woman on Board explores how Hampton methodically played the game of boardsmanship, using the soft power she cultivated amongst her peers to remove barriers that might have impeded the implementation and expansion of affirmative action policies and programs. Now, in terms of logistics, tonight's program will include a presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have time toward the top of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate that conversation and take those questions from both the chat and the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Donna J. Nicol. Donna, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Kevin, so much. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this evening and to share my work on Dr. Hampton. So let's get started. Here we go. So just a quick bio about me. Kevin mentioned that I'm currently an associate dean at Cal State Long Beach. I'm a professor of history. Prior to becoming an administrator, I served 20 years in the faculty ranks, which included 7 years as a department chair. course, I went to Ohio State, and my research has been published in a variety of different places. Most notably, or most recently, besides the book itself, is my work on philanthropy. I study conservative philanthropy and how it impacts educational outcomes. And so I was a featured guest for an Al Jazeera documentary that came out in 2021 called A Race for America, which looks at this kind of long history of philanthropy that affects educational, health, and social outcomes for African Americans. You can find my work in other types of publications as well. Race, Ethnicity, and Education, The Feminist Teacher, and so forth. I was a women's studies professor for my first 10 years. Then I went to Africana Studies. So my work straddles between both race and gender, and I consider myself to be an educational historian. All right, so for those of you, most of you are from California, I'm assuming, but for those of you unfamiliar with the Cal State system, let me give you some just quick background because it's going to make sense to the wider picture of the story. So it is the largest public university system in the United States, and we serve about 500,000 students every single year. The Cal State system was established differently than our UC counterpart, which was established, the UCs were established through the California Constitution as a public trust, which means that they get funding from the government, but they don't have the same type of strict controls. Whereas the Cal State system were created through a statutory provision in 1857. After the gold rush, we needed teachers to help educate students. And so the Cal States came under the control of the State Board of Education that was established in the 1850s. So as I say here, it was managed and controlled by the State Board of Education until the 1960s, when the UCs, the Cal States, the community colleges, and even independent colleges and universities came together and created the California Master Plan for Higher Education. With that, the Cal States became a system, and they took all of these kind of different campuses dotted all over the state, and they came under the control of the Board of Trustees and the Chancellor. One thing that we're really proud of in the Cal States is that over half of all bachelor's degrees awarded to Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans in this state come from the Cal State system. And why I point this out is something that we're proud of, is because we rarely hear about the Cal State system. As large of a system and complex as we are, and how many students we serve, there's very little that has been done in terms of research on the system. You will find way more publications on individual independent campuses or the UCs, but very rarely, my book is only the third book from my research, only third book that is written about the entire system. All right, so Claudia Hampton. Dr. Claudia Hampton was, as Kevin noted, the first Black woman trustee in the Cal State system. She was appointed by Ronald Reagan, and it was this photograph that I saw with a notation at the bottom that said Trustee Claudia Hampton, appointed by Ronald Reagan, and that is what sparked me to really write this book, because I was just curious with, what I thought I understood about Ronald Reagan and his politics with regards to race and civil rights. How could he have appointed this Black woman in 1970s, when he was still governor, to the California State Board of Trustees? She was the first Black woman chair, and she was the second longest serving chair. There was only one person who served 1 year before her. And she probably would have been reappointed, but she passed away during her last reappointment. So she served under Reagan, Jerry Brown, Duke Majan, and Pete Wilson. She was originally from Chicago, a former LAUSD elementary school teacher. And in the late 1960s, she was appointed as the director of a unit called Schools and Community Relations. This came about because of the Watts riots in 1965. One of the things that the Macomb Commission discovered is that there was a kind of de facto segregation in LA Unified Schools, and you needed someone to be a bridge between the district administration and the schools themselves to make sure that they were adhering to desegregation orders of Los Angeles Unified School District. Hampton earned her doctorate degree in education from USC, and even when she went into retirement, she was a lecturer in education at Pepperdine University, and she was extremely active in Los Angeles civic and civil rights organizations. Just to name a few, she was the founder of an organization called Women on Target. They helped to raise money for LA Unified School District, and they also helped to elect Black people, in this particular case, Tom Bradley as mayor of Los Angeles. She was also very involved with the NAACP. She was part of their education committee. She was a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. If you heard anything about Kamala Harris and her sorority affiliation, they are from the same sorority. And she served on civilian committees for LAPD. She was very, very much involved and engaged in Los Angeles civic and civil rights life. So with that background, I'm going to start to go into the book itself and some of the themes and some of the issues that come up. And so when I introduce Hampton, I start to talk about this idea of racial uplift theory. So Claudia Hampton had a doctorate degree. She, by all measures, she was part of the Black elite of Los Angeles. And what racial uplift theory really says is that for people who have kind of achieved making it, and whatever making it means, maybe it's a class definition and so forth, Hampton had a responsibility to other Black people who did not have the same opportunities she might have had. And so she had a responsibility to use her gifts, her time, her talent, her treasures, we like to say, in order to help promote access and opportunities for people who don't have them. And this is not limited to African Americans, it's also about low income students. One of the things that Hampton was very engaged in when she was in LA Unified was she was very cognizant of the economic disparities within the same school district. And so you could go to one side of town and everyone would have, all the books and facilities and good teachers that they need. And then you go to somewhere else and it would, have substandard everything. And so I explain in the book that part of the way Hampton is operating is through this racial uplift theory. Now, one of the challenges with racial uplift theory, it's connected to this idea of what we call respectability politics. And you may have heard of this term being kind of thrown around more recently. So respectability politics was an idea or a phrase that was coined by a historian, an African-American historian named Evelyn Higginbotham. And she was describing how Black women in the Baptist church would use respectability. They would use proper dress and they would speak in a particular manner. They would carry themselves in a way that was to signal and signify to the wider society that they were respectable Black people, that they were safe, that they were acceptable, that they were good in some kind of way. And so Hampton uses respectability as part of who she is. That's, she wears the proper dress, she carries herself in a particular way. And there's a lot of critique of that more recently. You have scholars like Brittany Cooper and Callie Gross who are saying hold on, there might be some problems with this respectability politics, because it's saying that you have to appear or you have to present yourself in a particular way that's acceptable to white people for them to respect our humanity. And so respectability is a conservative kind of way of moving through the world. But what we find, or what I found in studying Hampton, is that Hampton didn't do respectability politics because she felt like she was inferior to to white people or the wider society. She used respectability as a way to gain entree into white spaces so that people would feel comfortable around her so that she could negotiate on behalf of low-income students, Black students, women, Latino students. Having said all of that, as I was going through going through the archives and trying to make sense of what Hampton was doing, I had some hesitance because I was raised in the Black radical tradition. And so I didn't have a way to understand what she was doing. I was like, why is she talking in this? Why isn't she just telling these people this is wrong and this is the reason why you need to have affirmative action? But I had an encounter at an event at a conference, academic conference, where someone talked about sly civility, and I remembered this from grad school. So sly civility is a resistance strategy where the people who, like Hampton, are entering in spaces that they're traditionally locked out of, how they use they become civil with the dominant group so that they can learn their resources, learn their opportunities, get their knowledge, absorb all of that, and then pass off that information um, to other less fortunate or underrepresented people. So it's this way of working where you're almost like the conduit by which you pass on information to people who are also historically excluded. And once I heard that term and then went back to my old grad school notes, I realized that this was the way that Hampton was operating, because how unprecedented it was for her to be a Black woman entering into this predominantly white male space, which is the California State University Board of Trustees. And so that is the framework for understanding how she moved and operated within this system. But to go back a little bit, so to provide some context, I opened the book with a student strike. But most people, when they think about student strikes, they often think about San Francisco as the first student strike in California. But the real first one was actually at San Jose State a few months prior to San Francisco. And so in this first photograph, you have a picture of Harry Edwards, I'm sorry, who is on the megaphone. And he is a graduate student at San Jose State. And he, along with the Black student group there, decide that they are going to protest against discrimination in housing, Greek life, and athletics. And the way that they're going to do the protest is they're going to protest at a San Jose State versus University of Texas El Paso football game. And so to signal to the campus community that they were going to protest, they went into this, they did an interview with a local newspaper, and quickly the university scrambled for how could they prevent these students from walking out onto the football field and protesting. And the reason why they were protesting is simple. These students would go in and try to find housing because San Jose State didn't have a lot of student housing, so people could rent a room and there would be ads for room rentals. And as soon as Black students show up, these folks say, oh, the room has been rented already. Same thing was happening in Greek life, where Black students would apply to become part of a fraternity or sorority, and they would be excluded. And so San Fran San Jose starts the ball rolling in terms of letting people know, letting the trustees know in particular, that status quo was not going to be acceptable anymore. Now, the San Jose State situation ended without bloodshed. And in fact, the president of the campus, a man by the name of Robert Smith, quickly assembled a team to hear out the Black student demands and kind of come to a resolution. Unfortunately, however, there were trustees who were upset with Smith for negotiating with these Black students, most notably Ronald Reagan, who was governor at the time, but also an ex officio member of the trustees, as well as Max Rafferty, who was in charge, he was the superintendent of public instruction for the state. And both of them said that, you know, Smith had capitulated and he was engaging in what they called educational appeasement to these Black students. But this is the first time that the trustees actually weigh in on on a race issue. Some months later, you have the strikes at San Francisco State, and the trustees are very much involved in this one. Not only because of the length of the strike and the clashes between police and students, but because the Black students there had actually created a non-credit program called, which was their Black Studies program, or the precursor to Black Studies, through a thing called Experimental College, which was a non-credit bearing program where you can offer any kind of course that you wanted. Since it was non-credit bearing, it really didn't make a difference in terms of personnel. So these were student-led courses. Well, the Black Student Union's courses were so popular that they enrolled over 200 students every single semester. And so the students had started to make a demand to institutionalize Black studies. That's how Black studies gets created. And the trustees are weighing in constantly. Now they want to have control over the curriculum, where before they didn't really care about the curriculum. The trustees are really interested in, there's so many presidents at San Francisco State. Within an 8-year period, there's 7 different presidents. And so people are making promises to the students, they're reneging on the promises. You have all of this type of kind of chaos. And some of it is this idea of slow walking the enforcement of Black studies, or institutionalization of Black studies. That leads to the student strike. The student strike is really a clash between not really the faculty. The students and the faculty, they support one another, but it's the upper administration at San Francisco State and the trustees. That's where the clash is, because the faculty senate approved not affirmative action, approved Black studies pretty quickly, but the trustees refused to give them any funding in order to put courses on the books. The reason why I bring all of this up is that the notion of the public good prior to the 1960s, the emphasis was on access, and access was limited understanding of access was about finances. How many students can we bring in? How can we do this as cheaply as possible? But after the 60s, the students shift the notion of the public good to how can we let people who have been traditionally excluded from the university, how do we let them into the institution? So what I do in this chapter is really kind of say that the students are pressing for a different understanding of the university and who should it serve. So even after all of those protests, and even after the Johnson administration creates affirmative action in 1965 with an executive order, the Cal State trustees continue to slow walk the enforcement of affirmative action. And why I say this is because even in 65, you know, you have the executive order, in the UC system in 1959, they have a non-discrimination policy. It says you can't bar anyone because of their race, their gender, their national origin, and so forth. The Cal states still don't have a non-discrimination policy, let alone an affirmative action policy. Those are not the same thing. Non-discrimination, we won't bar someone. Affirmative action says we're going to actively recruit those groups that have been historically excluded. But the trustees were hemming and hawing about whether they should do this. And I have photographs here. On the more conservative end of this is the guy with the glasses is Wendell Witter. Wendell Witter of Dean Witter, the investment firm. He was appointed to the trustees under Pat Brown, and he was the trustee. And I heard this on recordings. Please, I'm just going to use the language as it was used. So forgive me. When Claudia Hampton he was in a meeting with Claudia Hampton, and he said, oh my God, there's a nigger in the woodpile. And so he was one of the people who was vehemently opposed to the enforcement of affirmative action. He couldn't stop it though, because the federal government gave new rules on affirmative action, on the implementation of affirmative action in 1972, after a group of feminists, particularly a group called the Women's Equity Action League, they started to petition the federal government and say, why haven't you extended affirmative action hiring to universities? They're federal contractors too. And so because of that, the trustees, the state officials had to do something to respond to the federal government, but they were very slow about it. Jerry Brown, I have here, even though he was described in the 70s as a flamboyant liberal and so forth, Jerry Brown also slow walked the enforcement of affirmative action by vetoing the Cal State trustees or the Cal State system's request for affirmative action funding. For whatever reason, Brown gave funding to the educational opportunity programs, but he would not give money in support of affirmative action. And at that time, affirmative action was limited to faculty and staff hiring. This had nothing to do with student admissions until much later. It would take some collective actions by a number of people for affirmative action to finally get implemented, and Claudia Hampton was at the center of that. So the first two chapters of this book are really context chapters to understand the climate that Claudia Hampton is operating out of. So let me go back a little bit. I should say here, with regards to some more of the misgivings on the enforcement of affirmative action, that by 1973, there is a second iteration of the California Master Plan for higher education. And in that, you have a completely different configuration of players. And at the center of that, you have more diversity, more racial diversity, not gender diversity, from the legislature. So you have people like Mervyn Dimely, you have people like Willie Brown. These are the first African Americans who are elected to the state legislature. You also have a man by the name of John, and I will butcher his last name, Vicelos, who is also very much kind of an equity-minded type of legislator. When the second iteration of the California Master Plan comes out, they realize that the issue of race diversity, again, they don't deal with gender, so I'm just going to make that clear, but racial diversity has not been addressed. And so out of that document comes legislation. It's called Assembly Concurrent 171, which mandates affirmative action with regard to student admissions. And so that's in 1974 when that legislation gets passed. it gives the Cal States, the UCs, and the community colleges up to 6 years, up to 1980, to develop a plan for how they are going to admit more students of color. So it's the federal policies and access to, well, one, the instructions on affirmative action, but also the higher ed funding that comes from the TRIO programs and so forth, grant monies. Then there's pressure from the state legislature. And so there's forces all coming together at the same time that are saying you got to enforce affirmative action. You might have slow walked it for about, at least 10 years, but you're going to have to turn the corner and enforce affirmative action. And part of the reason why Claudia Hampton gets appointed to the Board of Trustees by Reagan is that they need someone who can be on the board and make the rest of the board understand why affirmative action is important. And so I move on in the book and I have a chapter that's called The Conciliator Makes Dinner. And what I mean by this is that in that chapter, I start to talk about her vetting process. So Claudia Hampton has a chance meeting with Reagan's education secretary, a man by the name of Alex Sheriffs. Sheriffs is, now that Reagan is about to leave office, Sheriffs ends up at the Cal State system as the vice chancellor for academic affairs. He meets with Claudia Hampton in a group of officials from the NAACP, and they are discussing busing and desegregation. Well, from this big group of about 12 people, Sheriffs is meeting monthly with this group, just trying to kind of gauge their politics. And eventually out of that group, it whittles down to Claudia Hampton. And so Sheriffs goes to Ronald Reagan and says to him, hey, can you appoint this woman to the Board of Trustees? And Reagan's like, who is she? Because, he didn't know who she was. And he said, and Sheriff said, I just need a friendly face on the Board of Trustees. These things are coming down the pipe with regards to affirmative action. So she did meet with Reagan. They had a good conversation according to, the audio tapes that I heard from her. And that's how her appointment began. But ironically, Reagan and company did not tell Glenn Dumke. So this is the man on the far opposite end of Claudia Hampton. He's wearing the black tie with the stripes. That's Glenn Dumke. He's the second chancellor of the Cal State system, the longest serving chancellor. And he was not told that Claudia Hampton was being appointed. So he was a bit surprised to find out that this Black woman was being appointed. And in fact, the man standing next to him, a man by the name of Roy Brophy was friends with Alex Sheriffs. And so Sheriff said, hey, I got this woman is coming down to, we're going to get her appointed. Can you, put in a good word about her for me with Glenn Dumke? And so it kind of took, a chance meeting and Roy Brophy to get Claudia Hampton appointed. But she was appointed in 1974. And in that same year, that is when the Cal State system finally got a non-discrimination policy. Now, the reason why I title this The Conciliator Makes Dinner is that Claudia Hampton, for her first year, does not speak on the board. She doesn't talk. She just quietly observes. She says that she was observing the board, trying to figure out where she can make her mark. And she says that she realized that there were periods of time when she wouldn't hear from anyone from the board. And that every time she would go into meetings, it seemed like decisions were already made and that she was left out of the decision-making process. And so she said, I've got to figure out who to make deals with. She called it the game of boardsmanship. Who do I have to vote with so that they could trust me or think that, they could build a relationship with. And so she zeroed in on some of the most powerful trustees on the board and invited them to dinner. So she became the hostess to dinner with these men. And that afforded her the opportunity to negotiate with them directly about the issues that were important to her with regards to things like affirmative action and so on. I say in the book that she does this principally so that she can disarm the threat that's posed by her race. So she plays to the gender norm of being a hostess and cooking in order to make sure these men realize that she's not trying to usurp their power because she's a Black person. And so throughout this chapter, I present a number of strategies that Hampton used to build her power with these men in order, it's predominantly men. There's only one or two other women on the board at any given time. And so she quietly observes them, which I spoke of. She would get prepared for her meetings with the people she's cooking dinner with by having a meeting with the affirmative action officer, a man by the name of Herbert Carter, who was a Black man, who was the first affirmative action officer for the system. They would meet before she would cook dinner, and that would be a meeting where she would negotiate, and then she would go to a board meeting. And once she became board chair, another part of her preparation was to allow her allies to speak first. Her allies got to speak first, and so everybody would have to play defense. She would downplay. She wouldn't talk about her race explicitly unless it was necessary to get some legislation passed. When she became board chair, she did an acceptance speech, and she never mentioned the fact that she was the embodiment of history in the making as the first woman and the first Black person to ever chair the board of trustees. She accepted the responsibility of what she called herself the affirmative action trustee. And I'm going to play a little bit of audio for you so that you can hear what she says about being the affirmative action trustee. Just give me one quick moment.
I'm identified, I know, as the affirmative action trustee. It is expected, and I never fail, to march through thoroughly any affirmative action matters or anything related to affirmative action, to take a very strong stand, and to guard very carefully, not only to try to push for implementation of our own very good affirmative action program on paper. And I'm just the guard at the gate on all of those matters. And I think it's proper. I think it's necessary. And while I may be viewed in most matters as a moderate, I think by my peers and the constituencies on affirmative action, I'm viewed as, a real firm advocate.
Yeah, so Hampton really embraced this idea of being the affirmative action trustee. So in many ways, she took on that responsibility. She didn't shy away from it. It wasn't something that was viewed as a deficit to her. And in accepting that responsibility, she would always speak forcefully in favor of affirmative action, but she also would signal to her colleagues that she could be a moderate on other issues, but she was always going to stand up for affirmative action. She would build relationships to gain access and influence. And so in many ways, Hampton not only cooked dinner for these men, she would send Christmas cards to their families. She would ask about their wives. She would go on cigarette breaks with them. She joked and said that she would go to dinner with some of them, even the conservative ones that they didn't see eye to eye on. And that adding those personal touches really helped her gain access and influence. And then she did a thing that I call, or what is called in management circles, she practiced an instrumental type of leadership. Oftentimes people loved her so much that they would side with her because of their love and affection for her, not necessarily because they agreed with affirmative action or whatever policy that she was trying to put forward. So in this instance, Hampton is building this soft power that she's going to need in order to get things done. So that is, went the wrong way. Went too far. Okay, stop, stay. Okay. So having built all of that soft power, now about the 10-year mark, maybe a little sooner than that. Sorry, it's driving me crazy. All right. Sorry about that. Hampton decides that she is going to enact institutional change. Now that she has enough capital, she can negotiate equally with her peers. You can see here, she's having a conversation with one of the campus presidents, President Brownell from Cal State Dominguez Hills, and she's highly influential. The presidents love her. They go to her for advice and counsel constantly. So one of the things that I talk about in this next chapter is how she played the long game. And there is a particular instance where Hampton made a seemingly controversial decision in the short term, but it would bear fruit to her in the long term. Let me explain what I mean. So at Cal State Los Angeles, they were, the president, the long-serving president, was going to retire, and African Americans and Mexican Americans both wanted to see one of their own appointed to the presidency. Now, if you know anything about Cal State Los Angeles, it's located in an area after the Second World War. You have mostly Latinos that live in this area. So, it would stand to reason that they would want to have a president that, would come from that same area. African Americans also wanted a president because a lot of Black students were bused to schools within the area as well. Well, what happened was Hampton at this point is board chair, and the basically she knows one of the candidates. His name is Julian Nava, or Julian Nava. He was on the LA County or LA City School Board during the 1968 student walkouts. He was a professor of history at Cal State Northridge. He really had a good reputation within Los Angeles. But the committee ultimately chose a man by the name of James Rosser. James Rosser was a Black man from New Jersey. He was an assistant vice chancellor. He had the administrative experience. Well, because Hampton was on the school board, part of LA Unified, she knew Nava really well. And she decided that she was going to recuse herself from the decision-making process. Nava claims in his autobiography that she had promised him the vote and then capitulated to pressure from Black officials, most notably a woman by the name of Diane Watson, that she was going to just step aside and not vote and get enmeshed into this situation. However, the historical data also or record shows that Hampton was advised by general counsel to stay out of this voting process because of her relationship with Nava. They didn't want it to seem like she was skewing it in one way or the other. Well, Nava accused Hampton of acting like a gringo. That's his exact language. And so he said that, you know, relations between Black and Brown were permanently severed because of her decision to recuse herself. However, Hampton had done a lot of work to help Mexican Americans within the Cal State system, let alone her work in LA Unified to help Mexican Americans. So she had created teacher training programs to help increase the number of Latino teachers and so on. And so by the time all of this played out and it played out in the newspapers, and she ended up coming out of this kind of unscathed. And also she created, she helped to implement some new rules about the selection of presidents. She got an affirmative action program set up specifically for Mexican American students. And she also invited Mexican American student activists from Cal State LA to air out their grievances with regards to the process. So she came away from this much more on the winning side, even though in the short term that decision to not to recuse herself had her labeled as a sellout or playing like a gringo. The other ways in which she enacted institutional change was to strategically apply pressure with her allies of color. There was a Mexican American man and an African American man who came onto the board right after Hampton. Juan Quinones Gomez and Willie Stennis. And they would work as a team to apply pressure onto the board at strategic moments in time. Another thing that she did was I call it keep her finger on the institutional pulse. What I mean by that is if Hampton was appointed to, say, the Education Committee and the Public Affairs Committee, she would still make sure she would attend the Budget and Finance Committee because she knew that all of these policies were interconnected. And so she stayed abreast of what was going on all the committees. Hampton ended up serving on 9 of the 10 standing committees. She was the chair of many presidential hiring committees, hiring the next chancellor. She served on the California Post-Secondary Education Committee as a representative to represent the Cal State system for over a decade. And so she was constantly working, doing things to make sure that if she's going to move affirmative action along, she was going to stay active and engaged. And in fact, her work ends up, her work in the Cal State system gets acknowledged by Ronald Reagan with an appointment to a federal commission. So she is one of the first Cal State officials to be appointed to a federal board on elementary and secondary the financing of elementary and secondary education for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. She would finesse process obstacles. What I mean by that is, and I am a direct beneficiary of this. So during the Deukmejian years, they were going to increase the, what's that called? They were going to increase the tuition on students. And so Hampton said, well, if you're going to increase the tuition on students, you need to do a balanced fee policy. What that meant is every time you increase tuition on students, you have to give more aid to students. I ended up receiving a state university grant, which paid for my master's degree because of Claudia Hampton's activism. I'm going to move a little faster through the last bit, this last one. And I say here, she worked with the women and managed the men. She had a good working relationship with Ann Reynolds, who was the first woman chancellor. Ann Reynolds did not have a good relationship with the people who were her subordinates, presidents and so forth. But Hampton would be the go-between and help Reynolds enact her policies. Their partnership resulted in the largest increase in students of color and faculty and staff of color. Those percentages have not changed since the 1990s. And so Hampton is really critical there because these presidents like Brownell loved Claudia Hampton and would negotiate with her, but they would not negotiate with Ann Reynolds because they just didn't like her style. They did not like feminist or I will call bombastic, for lack of a better term, women. They like this soft-spoken Black woman. And so she ended up wielding a lot of power simply because she played to the gender norm instead of against it. So affirmative action ends in 1996. And what causes this? I concede that, or I concur, or conclude that it's a number of events. It's not one thing. One, there's a loss of higher education funding. There are a lot of political and cultural shifts, mostly because we have an economic recession. And during a recession, that is when you often see people want to get rid of, affirmative action or race-based initiatives. You also have this kind of broad scale attack on immigrants. Pete Wilson is almost about to lose his gubernatorial campaign, and then along comes Proposition 187. And so he starts to use this racialized rhetoric against Latinos and Asians. You have a lot of funding from conservative media outlets that start to associate things like the LA riots and this kind of chaos and disorder with these people are not deserving of affirmative action. They're not deserving of an educational opportunity. Look what they did to their community. And so all of these things kind of coalesce together and get rid of affirmative action. Claudia Hampton dies 2 years before affirmative action ends, but she is cognizant of the political shifts. And so before she passes away, she gets the trustees to start to make some policy changes. One big policy change is that presidents of individual campuses would be held responsible for the implementation of affirmative action instead of just putting it on this kind of staff person who didn't have a lot of power. She helped to rewrite the rules or the policies for the reappointment of trustee membership. So she put a lot of things in place. Even though she was getting sick, she passed away. She died of lung cancer. But before she passed away, she wanted to ensure that affirmative action, or at least the, these kind of race-based initiatives wouldn't die simply because she wasn't there. And to bring this all current, the issues that face Hampton in the 70s and 80s echo those facing Black women today. So we have the Supreme Court decision in 2023 that essentially got rid of affirmative action in college admission. You see the decline of state and public funding for higher education. You see Black women who enter into decision-making posts. If they do enter into decision-making posts, they're held to a standard that is often different than their peers. And connected to that, you have a lack of representation of women and people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color in decision-making posts. I put these pictures here. This is Dr. Claudine Gay. We know what happens. Most of us know what happened with her over the Gaza protests when she spoke before Congress. Instead of just, it became an assault on her scholarship as opposed to just about her stance. And then this is Dr. Candida Bailey, who unalived herself after she had asked her university, which was a historically Black college, but she asked them for support because she was having mental health challenges. And so, there's these kind of stereotypes about Black women in academia as being strong and aggressive, but presumed incompetent. All of those things that happened with Hampton, where Hampton needed Roy Brophy, a white man, to endorse her, that's similar to what Black women are still facing. And then wrapping this up, what can you learn from Claudia Hampton? Well, one, the power of governing boards to support or obstruct change. The trustees had opportunities at various intervals to either enforce affirmative action and to further it or obstruct it. Most of us don't know what trustees do. I was in the system for over 20 years and I didn't know how much power they had. There's a need to govern or to diversify governing boards. And I'm not saying this simply so that people can feel good about having, oh, we got this many of this and this many of that. You make better policy when you have people of differing backgrounds. And then finally, the importance of making a space for yourself at the table. Hampton was not okay with just being a passive observer. She really went out and sought ways that she could be effective. And so with that, thank you so much for your time and attention.
I'm back. You rushed yourself there at the end. I hope you got in everything you wanted to say.
I think I did.
Okay, great. Well, let's stop the share. Good, so we can see you full screen. Do you want to take a moment to fix your shade as the light creeps back up on your face? Or are you okay?
This is
Yeah,
driving me
go
crazy.
fix it. Because you can still hear me while I thank you for this. I mean, such a wonderful presentation. There's so much information that I didn't know about regarding the California State University system in general. Like we don't, like you said, we don't hear a lot about it. And it's so remarkable in so many ways. And I think people put some of that in the chat as well. But more than that, more than education on the California State University system, what a great introduction to such a fascinating individual. So smart, so sly, resilient. I mean, she had so many challenges, and clearly, I wrote down, clearly a master of the game of boardsmanship. Like she, I mean, clearly played played everybody, right? She got what she wanted. She was super influential, and I think that's great. I so amazing that she figured out what she needed to do to accomplish what she needed to accomplish. And I'm so glad that you wrote this terrific book about her.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, I was just so thankful that I rediscovered her, you know. It was I was looking for something else and just stumbled across her picture.
Yeah, that's crazy that you saw that picture and you're like, wait a minute, Ronald Reagan did this? I need to know more about that. Because
Yeah.
when you said that, I was like, no, that can't be right. There has to be something else going on here. That's pretty incredible, knowing everything we know about Ronald Reagan and the 70s and everything else that was going on.
Yeah.
Were you, I mean, I don't know if it's in the book, and if it's in the book, great. You can just say, Kevin, read the book. But can you tell us a little bit about her life, like her family life, her growing up? Did she have brothers and sisters? What did her parents do? And was she married? Did she have children? Like, what was her life like outside of the university system?
Yeah, so she was born in Mississippi but raised in Chicago.
Mm.
And her parents were pretty influential in her life in terms of getting an education. They had high school diplomas. But she and her brother were encouraged to go to school. She ended up graduating. She got her bachelor's degree at age 18 from YMC University, or college, sorry. And so the YMCA had a college in Chicago
Wow.
in the 1930s. And I detailed this in the book. It was, it later became Roosevelt University.
Oh, yeah.
But
Sure.
how they became Roosevelt University is because the Board of Trustees decided to cap and limit the number of Black and Jewish students. And so one of the faculty members, who became the president and founder of Roosevelt, took a group of faculty members and left in protest. Like, we were supposed to be here to provide opportunities to everybody, and you want us to limit it. And so that's where she attended school. She got her degree in, let me make sure I say it correctly because I will mess it up. She had a BS in chemistry with a minor in physics and biology.
Wow. That's crazy. That's cool.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so she could not find a job because she was a woman and because she was Black. And plus, she was really young when she graduated.
Mhm.
She went to school full time and kind of powered through it. And she says, and I talk about this in the book. She says, can you imagine being a Black woman graduating from college at 18, which I did, trying to find a job in those fields? No, in those days, there were no hesitancy in saying, we don't hire Blacks, we don't hire women. They'd be amazed that I'd even bother to apply.
Oh.
And so what she ended up doing, she got married pretty shortly thereafter. She had a child and she was working in a city office distributing welfare benefits.
Mm.
But childcare was becoming a problem. And so she went to her dad and said, hey, what should I do? She said, go talk to the ward captain. And so when the ward captain found out she had a degree, they were like, you should be teaching. And so she taught in Chicago public schools for about 5 or 6 years. Both she and her husband taught in the school system. And that's when he was moved out to California for a job and she followed along. And her first appointment was in East LA working with English language learners. So she had a daughter. She taught in LA Unified for a number of years before she moved into the administrative side of LA Unified to help with desegregation of the system. She was also part of the what they call the Council of Black Administrators, which was a group of Black administrators in LA Unified. My great uncle was one of the members, one of the founding members of that organization. And I find this out after I wrote the book, and I was like, oh, "Are you serious? Why didn't you guys tell me sooner?" But she was very much. She lived in View Park, which is a predominantly Black area. It's wealthy, by most people's standards. But she lived and worked in this Black area. She was always involved in these organizations that were connected to the community, and so though she had risen to this level of power, she was always connected to low, like folks in low income areas or to Black folks. She was always there. Yeah.
But did she well, first of all, she earned her stripes, Chicago public school system and then LA Unified. Yikes. The only one she didn't do was like the New York school system, New York
Yeah.
City school system. Um, what was, did she have a role as like clearly she was a leader and well respected, but did she take on like a role of a mentor in helping kind of bring in the next wave, the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, she was really involved with teacher education programs. That was her pet project. She
Mm,
worked with Maxine Waters, she worked with Willie Brown, she worked with them to
okay.
develop a lot of pipeline programs to increase the number of teachers in urban areas. So that was really important to her, was to make sure that there will be teachers that would follow behind her. And when she worked with Ann Reynolds, who was the first woman chancellor,
Mhm.
she helped to create a program called Step to College, which would have Cal State faculty go to teach classes on LA Unified campuses so that the students could see and work with a faculty member. So she would build pipelines. She also is responsible for the creation of a high school out here called the California Academy of Math and Sciences, which is a STEM-based high school that was designed for mostly low-income students. It's through Long Beach Unified, because LA Unified didn't want to take it on. So she was on a plane with a guy from Long Beach Unified. He was a superintendent. She gave him the idea and he said, oh yeah, we run with it. And so it sits on the campus of Cal State Dominguez Hills, and it has a very high rate of student acceptance into four-year institutions.
Well, we're past the top of the hour, but I'm going to ask one more question. And as I ask it, I'm also going to point everybody to the chat, because in the chat I put how to buy the book and how to find out more about you, and your website is all in there. So if you're still here in the webinar, check that out in the chat. But I thought if you could just take a minute to tell us about your whole research process and writing the book. I mean, you stumbled upon the idea and the subject to write this book. but clearly you've mentioned audio tapes that you've listened to. You shared one from the archives, such great photos and pictures you've shared. Tell us a little bit about like the process of putting this book together.
Yeah, so the first thing I did was I went to the Cal State Archives, which was at Dominguez Hills. And I said, look, I'm trying to study Claudia Hampton. And they were kind of looking at me like, eh. And they knew they knew of her because there was a building at Dominguez Hills named after her. So they knew of her, but they just didn't know a lot, in part because, she was kind of lost to history, so to speak. But they did say that Donald Girth, who was a former president at Sac State, Chico, and Dominguez Hills, wrote a history of the Cal State system. Look in there. So I looked, and she was in there. And so I said, okay, good. I now know who she is. There was maybe 1 or 2 pages written about it. This is a huge, it's like an encyclopedia more than anything. And they said, well, we have Girth's notes that he used to write the book. And I said, well, let me look through those notes. And I go into the box, and that's when I see the cassette tape at the bottom of it. And they said, we did a project called the California Gubernatorial Project, and we interviewed all the trustees or all the trustees who were chairs or influential trustees, but we don't seem to have hers transcribed and bound like we do everybody else.
Yeah, how convenient. Yeah.
Yeah, so I transcribed that interview. It was done, but it was not transcribed and bound. I transcribed it and I donated it back to the archive. Like, okay, now you need to bound it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I started to go through the trustee records, and I started the year that she was appointed, but I realized the folly of that. Like halfway, maybe I got to like year 4 or 5, and I said, this doesn't make any sense to me. I need all the context. So I had to go back to 1960. Now, if you've ever seen these archives, this is each meeting. There's 6 trustee board meetings there. That's the wide board. Then there are committee meetings, and there's 10 standing committees, and then there's ad hoc committees.
Yeah.
And then there are CSU reports. So I had to develop a system for how to read these things. Luckily, they were color coded. So if you had pink, that was going to be educational policy. If it was yellow, it was going to be faculty affairs. If it was green, it was going to be finance. like I had figured out that system. And so I had learned how to read these and take notes. So I took notes on every single thing that I touched. And so I ended up with probably, I think it was like 90 pages of single space notes. So that way I could have a database to go back to when I needed to know, okay, in what year did she say this, or in what year did they say that? And then I started to realize that certain terms that would come up constantly. Affirmative action would be a separate term. You would have EOP would be a term. And so I had just kind of developed my own little system. And sometimes even my notes would get snarky. Like I realized I was getting irritated by some of the stuff. So like when it came to Jerry Brown, my notes were mean, because it was like, why wouldn't he fund this?
Yeah, not this again, right?
Yeah. And so I had taken all of that. Then I went to different archives. So I went to San Jose State and went through their archive. I went to San Francisco State and went through their archive on the student strikes. So putting it all together, initially, I wrote the book as a straight chronology. And then I realized that was not going to work because I'm writing 2 stories at the same time. I'm writing a history of the Cal State system and affirmative action, and I'm writing a history, almost a biography of Claudia Hampton. So I had to get some help in understanding how to write these 2 stories that have like 3 arcs at the same time. And so the first 2 chapters were straight context and going to be chronological, and then I would go thematic. And so I would put the pictures, I strategically placed the pictures so that the reader would focus on the pictures and not keep thinking it's going to be this long his, chronological narrative, because it's going to shift pretty dramatically. Once you get to
Mhm.
chapter 3 and chapter 4, I introduce a strategy, I give a description, and then I give you a vignette to help you understand it.
Stand it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was a long project for a lot of reasons. One, I had job transitions. I moved from Cal State Fullerton to Dominguez. I became a department chair. I was still doing my conservative philanthropy work. So I was still publishing in that area. And then, of course, COVID slows everything down.
Mhm, mhm.
But
Yeah.
I got to chapter 3 and I told my husband, I said, I'm done. And he was like, no, you're going to finish that because you have torn this house apart with all this paper. You're going to finish that book.
You're in it. You got to get through to the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was amazing. Again, people, if you're still there, get the book. It's in the chat. A bunch of links. If you missed it and or for some reason, just email me. I can give you the links on how to get it. But definitely get this book and learn more about this incredible woman and all of these challenges and all of her accomplishments. It's so cool. But we are now at 6:15. We really are going to wrap up. I
Okay.
promise that we're going to wrap up. I'm going to start by, I guess, thanking you again. Thank
Thank
you so much for doing this. This was so amazing. And thanks to everyone out there for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next virtual program, which is Monday, August 19th at 5 o'clock, a week from today. It's titled The Alcott Family, Lessons from the 19th Century. And our speaker is going to be author, scholar, and collector Kent Bicknell. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in any of the weekly program emails that you're probably receiving from the Book Club of California. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again to our speaker, Dr. Donna J. Nicol. And everyone have a wonderful evening, be well, and take care of yourself. Thank you.